Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Five for Breakfast. We're now in our 19th episode of 2026, and the gold sponsor for Fiber Breakfast is Condux. Well, in Washington this week, Congress is back in session. Before the recess, Senator Thune, along with Senators Barroso and Lujan, introduced the bipartisan bill S4448, the Accelerating Broadband Permit Act, to require NTIA to create tools for tracking the progress of grant recipients under BEAD to improve transparency, accountability, and for faster progress in expanding broadband access nationwide. Separately, the House passed the Farm Bill, and the bill includes funding authorization for USDA's RUS program, including up to $350 million per year in funding for Reconnect through 2031. At the Department of Commerce, NTIA has now approved 54 of the 56 BEAD final proposals, and they plan to finish approvals by the summer, with Illinois and California being the outstanding final proposals left to approve. 51 of those states have signed their BEAD agreements with NTIA as well, meaning that their BEAD funds have been unlocked and they can begin the important work of finalizing subgrantee agreements and begin deploying high-quality, future-proof broadband to unserved and underserved Americans. At the FCC, the Commission is seeking public input to inform its upcoming 2026 communications market report to Congress, which evaluates the state of competition among U.S. communication sector. Comments are due on the 21st of May, with replied comments on June 22nd. And we're now only 4 days away from our annual Fiber Connect 2026 conference at the Gaylord Palms in Orlando from May 17th through 20th. And it's official. We will set our 6th attendance record in a row, with record network operator attendance really driving up the overall registrations. So if you haven't registered, please go to our website and register today. You're not going to want to miss Fiber Connect 2026. And last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Alan Isfan, the AI expert at Warner Brothers Discovery, discussed the fourth pillar of the AI era. This was a preview for the AI pre-conference workshop that Alan's going to be holding at 3 p.m. on this Sunday at Fiber Connect in Orlando. This pre-conference workshop will be instrumental in helping our attendees fully understand AI fundamentals so they can get the maximum benefit of Fiber Connect 2026 and our AI and Next Generation Technology Summit at Fiber Connect on Wednesday, May 20th. So if you missed last week's session, you can go to our website and watch the replay. Today on Five for Breakfast, our guest is Clayton Tino, the president and COO of Beep, Inc., to discuss fiber in the fast lane, power in the autonomous future. Clayton is the president and chief operating officer of Beep, overseeing daily operations and laying groundwork for the company's future scale. Prior to his role as COO, Clayton served as CTO, where his responsibilities he was responsible for product development, safety, regulatory affairs, providing strategic leadership and oversight over the development of Beep's autonomous mobility platform and services. Since joining Beep in 2019, Clayton has played an integral role in the growth of Beep's autonomous mobility business, having led the deployment and operations of a majority of Beep's autonomous vehicle programs to date. Prior to joining Beep, Clayton was at VirtuStream, a venture-backed cloud compute startup, where he started his career leading algorithm development for the company's global cloud management platform. After VirtuStream, he was acquired by EMC for $1.2 billion in 2015, and subsequently Dell Technologies in 2016. Clayton led the managed cloud platform organization, which developed highly scaled public cloud infrastructure products in partnership with VMware and Microsoft. Clayton earned a MS, a BS, and a PhD in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech, and holds patents in flight control systems and cloud platform management techniques. Welcome, Clayton, and for our audience, please type in your questions to go, and we'll work those in discussions. So with that, I will turn things over to Clayton.
Thanks for the warm welcome, Gary, and thanks for having me. I didn't realize they gave you the long form introduction, so I apologize to the audience for having to sit through that. So, I'm happy to be here to speak with the group today. I had a chance to chat with Gary earlier this week, and we had, I think, a pretty robust conversation about automated vehicles, about autonomy for 5 to 10 minutes. And And through the course of the discussion, Gary eventually asked, so what does this have to do with fiber? I said, yeah, that's a great question, Gary. So what I'm going to do today is first tell you a little bit about Beep. So, the autonomy industry today is, I don't want to say fractured, it's a very nascent industry. And though we've got, Waymo really going like gangbusters and proving what's possible in the space, Tesla starting to get autonomous technology into the hands of consumers, there's not really been a stable business model yet. And the ecosystem of who plays in that space is still very much developing. So I'll tell you a bit about where we fit in that space. Then I'll talk about why we do that. We have a particular lens on how we view the autonomy space specifically and what we're looking to accomplish. I'm then going to transition into kind of how we view the landscape from a technology perspective. And then, to Gary's point, get to what it actually has to do with fiber. We're a younger company, been around 6 or 7 years now, but I think have deployed as many AVs in the public sector space specifically than anyone else. And since day one back in 2019, I've had our vehicles open to the public. So we've got a kind of a wide range of experience in different kinds of environments and have seen the shift in kind of technology development and how we start to utilize the benefits of a more connected ecosystem as we move forward. So a little bit about Beep. We used to say we're an autonomous mobility service provider, and I used to tell people that's a very convoluted way of saying that we work with public sector agencies, be it public transit agencies or municipalities, or even private entities, be it commercial property owners or developers, to effectively use autonomous vehicles to implement mobility networks. The unique thing for me, I'm an aerospace engineer, as everyone was forced to listen to. We've been flying drones and unmanned aircraft for 50, 60 years. So when I entered this business, I thought, how hard could it be? Turns out it's pretty difficult, and it's not the vehicles themselves, it's everyone else on the roadway. And that's been something we've been solving for ever since. I think the second interesting learning for me was that an AV in and of itself doesn't really know what to do. I mean, it can drive, but there has to be a system supporting it to tell it where to go, what kind of service is it operating? Is it operating like a fixed line bus service? Is it operating in a ride share? Is it a dedicated ride vehicle? And all those things come into play to taking what is a very sophisticated piece of technology and turning it into something that is actually actionable by the public or by your customers. So Beep really set out to fill that space. Unique thing about Beep is we're not a vehicle developer. We learned very quickly that is a deep pockets, big boy game. And I think we've seen the consolidation of the space post-COVID. There are really only a handful of players that I think are really able to do that at scale. But we fit into that broader ecosystem in terms of how now do you take these AVs and incorporate into a public transportation system, a private mobility network, and then offering different types of modes of service to passengers. So think about what Beep does at its core. We partner with multiple vehicle OEMs and automated driving system developers to effectively bring different form factors of vehicles to market. And we do so in a B2B or B2G model. So from Beep's perspective, our customer is the city, it's the public transportation agency, or it is a private development group that may be looking to provide a mobility use case for their community. One of the other unique things that we do is because we work with a variety of vendors, we've had the ability to see kind of the development of the AV sector over the years and across industry. And we don't really pigeonhole ourselves to one particular form factor. So one of the things we believe very strongly is that to solve for mobility at scale, it takes a variety of vehicle types and capabilities, from larger fixed line vehicles like you'd see in a traditional municipal transit setup to smaller rideshare vehicles like you'd see in a traditional microtransit operation. So that's what we do. Now, why do we do it? Our company was founded by a group of entrepreneurs. Number one, my chairman and founder of the company professes himself as a lifelong entrepreneur, and he recognizes the fact that it's probably a disease at this point. And I have to say that it's probably contagious because I started working for him about 20 years ago and have been a startup person ever since. But the unique thing about Beep is that it was co-founded by his father, who was a mobility planner and actually ran a fleet planning for the city of Gainesville for many years. And he was dealing with a number of issues. One was aging drivers and not being able to actually serve the public because they didn't have drivers in there to actually staff service. And secondly, how to deal with electrification. So I think one of the unique things that brought me to Beep is aerospace engineering. I like technology, but also I see the societal value of what we're trying to do through autonomy. One of the tenets we believe very strongly in is the use of what we call ACES platforms, or automated, connected, electric, and shared platforms. And we believe in those for a few reasons. Number one, me taking a human-driven Uber or Lyft off the roadway and replacing it with a robotaxi isn't doing anything for congestion. So we do believe in a variety of shared vehicle form factors to support more than one person on the road in the vehicle at one time, and ultimately reducing congestion. Secondly, the value of autonomy from a safety perspective is absolutely real. I think as cell phones and mobile devices have invaded all of our lives to a lesser degree, distraction has never been higher. And that's specifically present while people are driving. I'm a frequent user of rideshare, and I'm absolutely convinced at this point that people are incapable of reading road signs because all they can do is look at what their GPS is telling them to do. And that's a double-edged sword, right? The more you're paying attention to the device, the less you're paying attention to the driving task, and the less safe you are being for everyone else on the road. So for us, we do believe in the value of autonomy to augment what a human is able to do and act more safely than a traditional human driver. The next bit is that, and this is something I feel very strongly about as a resident of the city of Atlanta, is enhancing access. One of the largest drivers of economic development in this country is mobility and having access to get from where you are to where you work. One of the benefits of public transportation is that it provides that at a lower cost point to the average citizen, as opposed to owning a vehicle. That said, it's expensive to operate. So one of the values we believe of autonomy is that it allows us to fill in those gaps where there may be mobility deserts, and to get people from their home to a bus stop or to a rail line, and to really solve that first mile, last mile problem. The last is electrification. I live in a city, noise is a big issue. The other part is overall lowering carbon emissions footprint. We do believe in the valuable electric platforms from a scale perspective as well, and from a business case for us. So again, one of the key areas we focus on is how we look at kind of an electric fleet future in terms of our overall fleet strategy. So that's who we are. That's why we do what we do. Let's actually get into a little bit of the use case of fiber. And I promised Gary we'd actually talk about fiber. So our view of the roadway is a little bit different. You can think about autonomous vehicles as being very capable mobile sensor packages, right? They've got the variety spins the gamut from, camera-only solutions like Tesla was trying for several years to, I'm sure everyone's seen a Waymo with the high-resolution spinning LiDARs on top of the vehicles. That's a religious debate. I'm not going to get into what the right answer is because everybody has their own solution and their own opinions on that. But because we operate a little bit differently, typically in partnership with public transportation, we view the landscape one level higher from that as well. So as opposed to just being solely focused of what's on the vehicle, we look at the ecosystem of things that surround those vehicles in a local infrastructure. And that's where we start to talk about fiber. One of the good use cases we see specifically is in the city of Jacksonville, where we've been operating the first automated public transportation service in the country. And I think the unique thing about that deployment specifically is that it's not just based on the vehicles, but we have full command and control of every piece of ITS infrastructure along the corridor where the vehicles operate. Everything from smart kiosks and bus shelters that allow people to request a ride on demand, to full CCTV coverage that provides this kind of real-time access to the operating environment, such that if there is an issue with the vehicle, if there is an issue with the passenger, we can tap into that infrastructure real-time and view what's going on. Some of the other unique things we do, I believe we're also the first AVs to implement any sort of infrastructure tie-in for transit. So we make heavy use of ITS infrastructure for transit signal priority, queue jumps, and everything that's associated with actually operating like you would a traditional city bus, but with automated vehicles in a fully automated control loop. So for us, when we think about how we look at deploying AVs, it's not just can we buy the best vehicle, but what type of infrastructure can we use to support those vehicles? And that includes requirements for typically fiber connectivity where we're going to be operating to, again, support things like CCTVs, ITS infrastructure, and in other cases, 5G as well. So from Beep's perspective, how this plays then in terms of how we see this rolling out, we really specialize in two layers from a technology perspective. We have our package of technology that we deploy on autonomous vehicles. And the easiest way to think about describing those is we do everything that a human bus driver does that's not driving the bus. So if you think about the last time you rode on a city bus, they're doing everything from fare enforcement to passenger safety and security. We develop a technology package that we deploy, and that connects to our supervisory and management system that we use to actually manage the onboard environment. Not going to get too much into that. That's not the case of this presentation, but if you have any questions, you have my contact info. I'm happy to talk your ear off about it. The second thing we do is that we operate centralized command and control, and that's where the fiber network really starts to pay dividends. We have a fully staffed command center that we operate in partnership with the local transit authority in Jacksonville, and that's where we perform several tasks, from in-cabin monitoring to vehicle tasking and orchestration in the downtown area. to teleassistance. I think one of the primary use cases for fiber connectivity and specifically high-speed wireless is being able to provide remote assistance to vehicles when they do get stuck. That's another religious debate I won't get into at this point, but one of the things we support is specifically teleassistance, not what you would call teleoperation or remote drive capabilities. Effectively, you can think about a use case where if you're driving down the lane, there's a blockage for whatever reason, the vehicle has to be retasked. We can pull up live information on the vehicle, cameras, sensor information, and provide effectively dynamic information to the vehicle. So approving maneuvers, approving guidance that are then performed by the vehicle itself. So we don't necessarily want to be in the business of having someone in a remote driving cockpit, providing brake throttle steering to vehicles remotely, but we do provide remote assistance to those vehicles when they do get stuck. The last thing we do there is provide kind of comprehensive supervision of the entire system. Again, we're not operating a fleet of robotaxis that may just be picking Gary up from his house and taking him to his office, but it's heavily orchestrated. We're incorporated with traditional transit bus lines. There's a Skyway service in that city as well. So we look at connectivity and allowing passengers to meet pretty strict transfer timelines across modes as well. So if you think about the ecosystem of technology that's required to really facilitate this kind of operation, it drives a few key points for us in terms of how we think about the role of fiber in enabling autonomy, at least in the way we view the industry. And again, I realize we're unique from a Waymo or an Uber, which may specifically be looking at kind of a fully vertically integrated, you call a ride, it picks you up, it takes you where you want to go. But again, our thesis is how do we enable cities to be smarter? How do we enable cities to provide better mobility options? And how do we do so in an integrated operating environment? So now getting to the point of how do you actually scale this in a real world? One of the things we learned very quickly is that expanding a deployment footprint really requires an ecosystem of a few things. Obviously, you have to have a place to store the vehicles. If they're electric, you have to have a place to power and charge them. But lastly, they're pretty incredible connectivity demands. You can think about just a O&M or operations and maintenance facility or garage as being kind of your fleet location for where you store vehicles. But in reality, they're kind of a mix of environments. It's not just a location for maintenance and charge vehicles. They're kind of mini data centers. The average AV can produce upwards of 1 terabyte of data over a single operating shift. And now that we're in kind of the AI future, all of that data is extremely valuable. You can think about every camera recording, every LiDAR recording, every driving action taken by the vehicle, every perception, we'll say characterization made by the platform in terms of understanding what it perceives on the roadway. All of that is valuable data that can be used to train additional driving models, that could be used to train simulations from a safety and validation use case, and all that data has to go somewhere. So we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to find locations that have both physical storage and the power to actually power the fleet, but lastly, connectivity. And that's always the thing people forget. Being able to support, several 100-gig symmetric connections with, direct connect capabilities to various cloud providers is typically non-trivial for your typical public transit operator. And actually trying to spec out a building like that and find one that's really available is a huge challenge. So dealing with the volume of data and need for robust fiber connectivity wherever we're operating is a huge challenge. Secondly is co-location. I'm going to say beaten the horse on that, but we've tried to do various things like, hey, we've got a data facility here, we've got a storage and O&M facility over here. Can we ferry data back and forth using hard drives? To be blunt, it's a huge pain. It's extremely inefficient. It doesn't work the way you think it would. And actually having real-time access, in the example of a collision or an incident, having the connectivity where your vehicle maintenance facility is extremely important. The last piece, and I kind of talked about this already, but the value of having roadside connectivity is becoming more and more important. I think when we started the company, 7 or 8 years ago, we were in the middle of this whole DSRC, dedicated short-range communications, or C-V2X, LA or V2X technology for how roadside infrastructure interacts with vehicles. That situation aside, one of the biggest things for us was just frankly the lack of connectivity in certain municipalities to even support implementation of certain types of technologies. So what we're seeing cities do now is as they start to lay new roadside infrastructure, is actually think about fiber and where they're going to start providing actual connectivity along the roadside, not just for ITS infrastructure, but also now edge compute. we have a pretty interesting use case we're looking at with a couple of large ITS providers to look at how do we not only provide additional sensing and communication to vehicles, but how do we start to do our own road sign sensing now and potentially even augment what the vehicles can detect themselves. So I had to sum up, where we see fiber playing a key role in the proliferation of automated vehicles. It's really kind of in those three key areas. It's how do we manage the volume of information coming off the vehicles in real time? How do we co-locate access to that, call it data backend infrastructure, such that it's actually useful from an operational context, and we're not having to, we'll say, deadhead vehicles 20, 30 minutes from a storage facility where we have robust connectivity to an operating area. And then lastly, how do we start to think about the, we'll say, growth of connectivity along the roadside, not just for wireless capabilities, but also for additional sensing infrastructure that may support AV operations. So Gary, that's what I have. I try not to get too far on the AV side and actually bring it back to fiber, but I'm happy to take any questions that the team may have or open the floor.
Oh, Clayton, this is super interesting. I'm not a big fan of being in a vehicle, and that's why I live on an island. So can you start with your customer is a municipality? Is that what your target is?
Yeah, we have a couple. So typically we would work directly with a city or a transportation authority or a development authority that has the right to provide mobility services within an area. We do have a private sector business as well, and typically in that case it's going to be, a facilities operator, a developer who may be developing a master plan community, but it's typically going to be a large business entity or a government entity.
And so can you talk a little bit about why your segment's unique from, you mentioned Waymo, which is more in the robotaxi, and then we have autonomous trucking, and then we have autonomous light rail. And so your very specific target is more on autonomous busing. And is that right? Or how can you?
It is. Yeah. I think it's the most reductive way to say it is that when we founded the business, no one else was doing it. And that's always a good thing. But I think as we've looked at the way this plays out, it's very hard from frankly, just a capital perspective to actually launch a fully integrated service. I mean, Waymo has been extremely successful because they have a lot of money and it takes a lot of money to do these kind of things. Yeah. And there's a lot of capital that is ultimately put at risk that you're trying to recoup through passenger fees or passenger fares, right? And it's never been our model to take a single vehicle out, amortize it over 5 years and hope we make it back on the other side. Number one, we don't think it's the right solution for an area. Again, it kind of goes against our thesis of why we're in the space to begin with. The other side is it allows us to be more directly engaged with the city. I think one of the unique things that we do that, the original rideshare groups didn't do several years ago is talk about how does our service solve the use cases they're trying to solve for. So we're not coming in and violating taxi rules. We're not stealing passengers from public transportation. We're ultimately working with them to help augment the services they're already providing to their community because we want the use case to fit the need. So I think in terms of what we do differently, that's the key, I will say, innovation from a commercial perspective, from our perspective, is being able to partner with municipalities, partner with cities, partner with the transit authorities to help expand and extend what they're doing as opposed to be in direct conflict with it.
So we got a lot of questions from the audience. So in Jacksonville, who owns the fiber network, and do you lease fiber and operate the network?
It's a very complicated question. So Jacksonville is a unique area. I'm just not sure if folks are familiar with how it operates, but there's the JEA, the Energy Authority, and the JTA, the Transportation Authority. And there's some very complicated agreements between who laid the fiber, who gets access to it, and how it was lit up for this use case. Ultimately, there was an agreement between those two entities to utilize that fiber that had been laid several years ago. And it was utilized to both deploy the roadside network infrastructure and to operate a private 5G network specifically for the vehicles. In that case, Beep is never the infrastructure owner. We typically don't even lease it out. We provide strictly the mobility service, and any, we'll say, supporting infrastructure is typically provided by our customer or operating partners in that area.
And one of the other questions is, what's the best way to get what's the best non-wired way to get a terabit of data off a fleet vehicle each day?
I mean, if anyone has any ideas, they're more than welcome to email me, because that's a great question. We've done experiments with millimeter wave, and there's just not a good one. I mean, the easiest way is to pull into a bay and jack a 10 gig connection to the vehicle. We've been looking at various ways to do that. Microwave, millimeter wave. They don't scale well, and the range is very limited. So again, Gary has my contact info. If you have a product that solves for that, I'm more than happy to have a chat with you.
Well, in the Ukraine war, they just tether their drones with fiber. So maybe you just tether all your autonomous vehicles with a little fiber to run up and down the road.
Exactly. That wouldn't cause an issue, I'm sure.
Yeah. Another good question here is, can you share any insights on the challenges currently faced in implementing low latency fiber infrastructure for autonomous vehicle operation?
So we typically don't have too many issues with low latency. And again, that goes back to kind of a comment I made during the presentation. They're kind of a two thought process in terms of how you deal with latency in AV operations. And it really has to do with remote interaction of the vehicles. We've taken the stance that we don't want to be, again, providing real-time command and control information to the vehicle. So we're not providing throttle, brake, steering. And because of that, our needs for super low latency, we'll say less than 10 millisecond or less than 20 millisecond connectivity, it just doesn't exist. We've kind of obviated the need because we just don't believe in that kind of method of management. We are more resilient to higher latency connectivity because we ultimately believe in being able to provide, we'll say, guidance. So you can think about the distinction between we're not flying the plane, we're programming the autopilot and allowing the plane itself to execute the command. And in that case, we're much more resilient to high latency connectivity. We'll say higher latency connectivity.
Yeah, I think I mentioned to you last time we spoke is, I was in a presentation with Florida State where they were showing what the future of a city looks like that has all autonomous vehicles, where the roadway gets so narrow because, the tolerances on autonomous vehicles, you don't need a lot of tolerances. You don't need parking spots. For us, we're just going through city council on, some restaurant renovations here on the island, and parking. You don't want any more, asphalt or concrete, and you're trying to eliminate that, So as you move into Atlanta, I can see where, or Jacksonville or any of these places, metros, how does this work in a non-metro area?
That's a really good question. I think we've got, and I think there are probably two different ways to answer that. The first is if you look at, we'll say, the undeveloped areas. We've partnered with a lot of real estate developers and developers in general that, ask us, what do we have to do to support automated vehicles? What should our infrastructure look like? What should our roadways look like? And for us, we ultimately believe that it's going to be a transition over many years, right? We're not going to be to an area where every single vehicle on the roadway is automated. So because of that, it's typically, well, make sure the lanes are at least this wide, give this amount of turning radius, but otherwise do what you typically do. We typically don't advise folks to make purpose-built infrastructure for AVs because ultimately it's going to limit what they could do in the future, both from a platform perspective and in terms of allowing other residents to use the areas. I would say that the rural question is super interesting, though. So let's talk about how we manage things like long-haul trucking, how we manage access to rural communities. I think things like Starlink and connectivity that doesn't rely solely on wireless has made a lot of the challenges associated with rural deployments, I don't want to say simpler, but much more solvable. One of the typical use cases or requirements for AVs is just at least semi-robust cellular connectivity. If you think about being on tribal lands or in areas where there may not be robust even LTE coverage, let alone 5G, that's been a huge challenge. But now that we've seen other, we'll say, non-terrestrial based solutions for providing connectivity, it's helped to solve a lot of those challenges. So again, I go back to kind of two different things. From a kind of general planning perspective, we don't advise people to do anything differently than they typically would because, again, I think we're decades off from a world where a majority of vehicles are automated. And the second bit, in terms of non-developed land, again, having non-terrestrial based connectivity has been a huge game changer.
I'm surprised you say decades off. Last summer, I think I mentioned a few times on Fiber Breakfast that, I think I was in Houston and a Waymo came in to the airport and it would look like a student driver was, just freaking out. I was, just obviously sensor overload on all the traffic and everything. And then like 2 months later, I come into Phoenix Airport and the same amount of congestion and traffic, and the Waymo zipped in, picked up its passenger and zipped out like nothing. And I was shocked at how the acceleration of progress in just a few months.
Two different things though. I don't think it's not that I don't think the technology will be capable. I think it'll be more adoption and the model in terms of how you manage that, right? Today, and this was a conversation I had a few years ago with a gentleman who worked for a large OEM that was developing an automated vehicle. And he gave me an estimate that for a consumer to buy their off-the-shelf automated vehicle would probably be around $650,000. And I'm sitting here thinking, would it make any sense for me to buy a $650,000 vehicle that's going to sit in my driveway 90% of the time, 98% of the time? No. I mean, I'd buy a Bentley and hire a driver, and I'd probably have a much better experience at a cheaper price point. So it's not that I don't think the technology will be viable. I think the technology is advancing more rapidly than I think any of us had expected, especially the past 2 years. But I think the cost dynamics, the buying dynamics, who the end customer is, are going to take a long time to develop. And let's be honest, Americans love owning their cars. I think, getting to a point where you are going to completely cede ownership and rely on a third party to provide all of your transportation, I think culturally that doesn't sit with me in terms of what I view the average American thinking today.
Well, I'm all in for someone else owning the car and giving me a ride. But, well, Clayton, thank you so much. I really appreciate you sharing your expertise and insights with our audience today, and look forward to seeing Beep's success as we move into this whole era of autonomous vehicles. And I want to thank everybody for joining us, and I look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We'll be at Fiber Connect in Orlando, and so our next Fiber Connect will be from the main stage in Orlando with Josh Kim, the co-founder of Starfront Observatories, who's going to discuss delivering the nighttime sky with fiber. This is going to be epic. It's this whole telescope farm. I'll call it Stargate as a service, and it's really neat. And so I hope you guys will join me that next Wednesday for that. Thanks, everyone. Look forward to seeing everybody this Sunday down in Orlando.